Trevor Morrow was an ordinary man with a mundane job, living in a modest house in a quiet suburb. He followed the same routine every day: wake up, go to work, come home, eat dinner, watch some television, and go to bed. Life was predictable, almost mechanical, but something inside him simmered, a suppressed anger that he never let show. He had always been the calm one, the rational one, the one who never raised his voice or allowed his temper to flare. That was until a series of strange events began to unravel the tightly wound threads of his sanity. It was a typical night when the first knock came. Trevor had returned home late from work, exhausted from another long day. The clock on the wall had just struck midnight when he finally crawled into bed, hoping for a good night's sleep. But sleep did not come easily. His mind was restless, filled with the tension of unresolved frustrations. He eventually drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud knock on the door. His eyes shot open, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. Trevor lay there, listening, wondering if he had imagined the sound. But then it came again, louder this time, echoing through the stillness of the night. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Who could be knocking at this hour? Trevor reluctantly got out of bed, his heart thumping. He crept down the stairs and approached the front door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned in close to the door and asked, "Who's there?" Silence. Trevor frowned and peered through the peephole. To his surprise, there was no one there. He waited for a few seconds, straining his eyes to see if anyone was hiding in the shadows, but the street outside was empty. Slowly, he unlocked the door and opened it. A gust of cold air greeted him, but there was nothing else, no sign of anyone or anything. Confused and a little unnerved, Trevor closed the door and locked it securely before heading back to bed. What a stupid joke, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. The next day passed uneventfully. Trevor went about his day, trying to forget the strange incident. But as night fell and he returned home late again, the memory of the previous night's knocking gnawed at him. He brushed it off as a one-time occurrence, perhaps just a prank by some neighborhood kids. However, as the clock neared 2 a.m., he found himself unable to sleep, anxiously awaiting the dreaded knock. And then it came, right on cue. The same loud, insistent knock that shattered the silence of the night. Trevor bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. This time he was furious. Who the hell was doing this? He stormed downstairs, ready to confront the prankster, but once again, when he opened the door, there was no one there. The empty street stared back at him, mocking his anger. "Damn it," he swore, slamming the door shut. It was the second night in a row, and Trevor's nerves were beginning to fray. Determined to put an end to this, Trevor decided to set up a camera at the entrance the next day. If anyone came knocking again, he would catch them in the act. He spent the day at work thinking about the plan, convinced that it would finally put an end to the mystery. That night he set up the camera, positioning it carefully to cover the entire front porch. Satisfied with his preparations, he went to bed, his mind racing with anticipation. As expected, the knock came again at 2 a.m. Trevor was ready this time. He jumped out of bed, adrenaline pumping through his veins, and hurried downstairs. He flung the door open, but just like before, the porch was empty. His eyes narrowed with frustration as he looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. His anger boiling over, Trevor grabbed the camera and took it upstairs to review the footage. He sat down at the kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly as he plugged the camera into his laptop. The video began to play, showing the empty porch in grainy black and white. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the screen flickered as something appeared at the edge of the frame. Trevor's breath caught in his throat as he watched a strange, long, and thin creature emerge from the shadows. It had pale, almost translucent skin, and coal-black eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. The creature approached the door, its movements unnaturally fluid, and knocked 3 times before swiftly darting out of view. Trevor sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief. His mind struggled to process what he had just seen. The creature was unlike anything he had ever imagined, a nightmarish figure that shouldn't exist. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and his hands trembled as he replayed the footage, hoping that he had somehow made a mistake. But the creature was real, and it had come to his door. The next morning, Trevor made a decision. He couldn't stay in that house any longer. He took a day off work, packed up his belongings, and moved to a different part of town, hoping to leave the terror behind. The first few nights in the new house were peaceful. Trevor began to relax, convincing himself that whatever had haunted him was now far away. But deep down, a nagging fear lingered, a fear that the creature might find him again. 3 days after the move, Trevor was once again jolted awake at 2 a.m. by the sound of knocking. His heart sank as the familiar dread washed over him. He lay still, hoping that if he ignored it, the knocking would stop, but the sound persisted, each knock growing louder and more insistent. Trevor's body tensed as he realized that the nightmare had followed him. Then he felt it, a sudden, bone-chilling cold that swept through the room. The air around him grew frigid, as if all the warmth had been sucked out. Trevor sat up, shivering, and looked around the room. He had made sure to close all the windows before going to bed, so where was the cold coming from? His breath came out in misty puffs as he slowly turned his head toward the source of the cold, and froze in terror. The front door was wide open. Trevor's blood ran cold. He knew he had locked that door before going to bed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had the door opened on its own? And who, or what, was responsible? A heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched settled over him, and he instinctively turned to look down the hallway. At the far end of the corridor, standing just within the shadows, was the creature. It was even more horrifying in person, its pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. The coal-black eyes locked onto Trevor's, and he felt as though they were piercing straight through him. The creature's presence filled the air with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if all the fear and anger Trevor had ever suppressed was now materializing in front of him. For a long moment, neither Trevor nor the creature moved. They simply stared at each other, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Trevor's mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body was paralyzed with fear. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Finally, Trevor found his voice. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling with terror. The creature let out a low, guttural growl that made Trevor's skin crawl. Its mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. When it spoke, its voice was a deep, raspy growl, more animal than human.
"You know who I am."
Trevor's mind raced, trying to comprehend what the creature meant. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The creature took another step forward, its eyes never leaving Trevor's.
"You brought me into your head,"
it growled, its voice filled with malice. Trevor's heart pounded in his chest as the creature's words sank in. It was speaking directly to his deepest fears, his darkest thoughts. "What are you talking about?" Trevor asked, his voice shaking. "How could I bring you here? Who are you?" The creature's grin widened, and it let out a low, menacing laugh that sent shivers down Trevor's spine.
"I am you,"
it said, its voice dripping with malice.
"I am the thing that lives inside every human being and longs to come out. Something that's just waiting for the right time to emerge. I am the animal that you repressed inside you, the rage and anger that you buried deep down, but you never forgot that I exist. And now, after so many years, I've finally managed to break free."
Trevor stood there, his mind reeling as the creature's words cut through him like a knife. He remembered all the times he had held back his anger, the times he had swallowed his pride and forced himself to stay calm when he wanted to explode. He had always prided himself on his self-control, but now it seemed that his repressed emotions had taken on a life of their own. The creature began to move toward him again, its movements slow and deliberate. Trevor took a step back, his body trembling with fear. He realized that he was facing the embodiment of all the anger and aggression he had kept bottled up for years, and now it was coming for him. In a flash of panic, Trevor remembered the gun he kept in his nightstand in the hallway. Without thinking, he turned and bolted for the drawer, yanking it open and grabbing the gun with shaking hands. He spun around, aiming the weapon at the creature. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling. The creature paused, its black eyes narrowing as it stared at the gun. For a moment, Trevor thought he had a chance, that he could stop this nightmare. But then the creature let out another low, guttural laugh, the sound sending shivers through Trevor's entire body.
"You think you can stop me with that?"
The creature growled. "I am a part of you, I always have been, and you can't kill what's inside you." Trevor's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth of the creature's words. This was not some external monster. This was a manifestation of his own suppressed rage and fear. And now it had taken physical form, determined to destroy him. But Trevor refused to give in. With a cry of desperation, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house. The next morning, the quiet suburban street was disturbed by the flashing lights of police cars and the muffled muttering of curious neighbors. The police were called to the scene after a report of a gunshot, and what they discovered inside Trevor's home was a gruesome scene. Trevor Morrow was lying on the floor in the hallway, holding a gun in his hand, and his head had been shot through. The room was splattered with blood, and Trevor had an expression of pure terror on his face. There was no sign of intrusion, no evidence that anyone else had been in the house. The case was quickly ruled a suicide, and so the case was immediately closed. Neighbors, however, whispered among themselves. They'd always thought there was something strange about Trevor, something that simmered beneath the surface. And now it seemed, what had been lurking inside him was finally coming to light. But only Trevor knew the truth, and that truth died with him.